They never said it out loud. But I knew. They thought I was the failure in the family. The one who left. The one who came back with nothing. At every family gathering, they'd pass me the paper plates, never the decisions. Like I didn't matter. Like 25 years in uniform meant nothing. My brother got the land. My sister got the money. And me, I got silence. Even my name was missing from the photo albums. Just empty spaces where I used to be. But last winter, the president said my name on national television. He said, Admiral Evelyn Hayes. And for the first time, they looked at me. Really looked. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, if they made you feel like everything you gave was never enough, you're not alone. Would you fight for recognition or walk away quietly? Tell me, where are you listening from? Have you ever had to prove your worth to the people who were supposed to know it all along? I got home 2 days after Christmas. Snow still covered the barn roof, but the cheer had melted away. The house looked the same. Peeling white paint, rusty swing by the porch, but something had shifted. Or maybe it was just me. No one met me at the station. I carried my own bag, felt the weight of it deep in my spine, and deeper in my chest. Mom opened the door like I was a delivery she forgot she ordered. "Oh, you came," she said, then walked back to the kitchen. I stood there for a minute. Boots dripping on the welcome mat, same mat I helped her pick out 12 years ago. The table was set for 4, but not 5. Luke was pouring sweet tea. Carla slicing ham. I got a paper plate and the heel of the bread. "You're back for how long?" Carla asked. Not in a warm way. Just like an inconvenience. "Not sure?" I said. And that was the end of it. No one asked about the Navy. No one asked what I'd been through. They just kept chewing, like I was background noise. I noticed it then. The framed photos on the wall. Family trip to Virginia Beach. Luke's wedding. Carla's graduation. I wasn't in any of them. Not one. Not even the one I remembered Mom taking. Me in uniform, medals fresh, standing proud by the flagpole. Gone. She didn't say anything. But she didn't have to. That night, I couldn't sleep. The couch creaked every time I turned. Too short for my legs. Too cold, even under 3 blankets. I stared at the ceiling. Cracks like little road maps. I used to trace them with my finger when I was a girl, pretending they led somewhere far. Dad's truck used to pull in late, exhaust hissing like a dragon, headlights sweeping the ceiling. It meant he was home. It meant I could sleep. He wasn't perfect. But he saw me. When the others rolled their eyes, he'd wink and say, "She's tougher than all of you put together." Summers were my favorite. He'd wake me at 5, hand me a biscuit, wrapped in paper towel, and say, "See, Mun. Let's go fix something." The smell of hay, gasoline, and black coffee still lives in my bones. We'd work side by side, grace on our hands, sun in our eyes. Sometimes he'd teach me names of tools. Other times, he'd just hum. No talking needed. That was the only time I felt like I belonged. Like I wasn't too loud. Too different. Too much. Carla hated the heat. Luke stayed inside playing games. But I wanted to be out there, wrench in hand, mud on my jeans. Mom said it wasn't ladylike. Said I was wild, like a stray dog. But Dad never told me to be softer. He just showed me how to stand my ground. When he died, everything changed. The barn was locked. The truck sold. And I was edited out. Little by little. Until there was no room left for the girl who smelled like motor oil. The next morning, they held a meeting. At the kitchen table, without me. I walked in halfway through. Luke was pointing at a notepad. Carla had her reading glasses on. They went quiet. Like I'd crashed something I wasn't invited to. "Sorry?" I said. Didn't know this was a closed-door session. Mom didn't look up. Just talking numbers. She mumbled. Her voice had that tight edge, like she used to use when I spilled milk as a kid. I poured myself coffee, sat on the far end. Listened. They talked about taxes, repairs, selling the lower pasture. No one asked my opinion. No one said, "Evelyn, you lived here too. What do you think?" And then Carla folded a paper in half, slid it toward Luke. He didn't look at me, just nodded. That was it. Like I didn't exist. Later, I found the paper in the trash. It was a copy of the deed. My name had been printed, then crossed out. In pen. I didn't say anything. Not then. Instead, I walked out to the barn. The doors groaned as I opened them. The air inside was still thick with dust and old hay. But the light cut through like a knife. And there, on the far shelf, was Dad's toolbox. Still locked. Still scratched with my initials from when I was 12. Still waiting like a piece of me they hadn't stolen yet. I touched the handle. It was cold, solid, real, unlike everything else. And in that moment I knew. They hadn't just taken the land. They'd decided, years ago, that I didn't belong. It started with an email. Or rather, with my name showing up where it shouldn't have. I was helping Mom pay a water bill online. She still used a decade-old laptop, the kind that wheezed when it booted up. The screen had a yellow tint, and the letters on the keyboard had long rubbed off. She'd written all her passwords on a sticky note taped to the side. I logged in like I'd done 100 times. Nothing unusual. Until she walked off to stir the soup, left me alone with her inbox. I wasn't snooping, but there it was. Flagged red, bold subject line. Final confirmation of transfer, land fund program. I clicked. My breath caught halfway down my throat. It was a government form. It looked official. Dates, signatures, all formatted like any of the hundreds I'd filed during my years in the Navy. And, at the bottom, authorized by Evelyn M. Hayes. I stared at that line for a full minute. It wasn't just my name. It was a signature, scanned and pasted. Neat. Precise. But it wasn't mine. Not the slanted, I always loop. Not the shaky tail of my M from years of signing reports half asleep. It was off. Too clean. Too careful. Like someone had tried to be me. But only from memory. My hands turned cold on the keyboard. The cursor blinked back at me like a warning light. I didn't move. I heard Mom humming behind me. The spoon tapping the side of the pot. Chicken broth. Thyme. Something burnt at the edge. I clicked out, closed the tab, deleted the history. But nothing could delete that feeling in my chest. Someone forged my name. And not just for anything, but for a transfer tied to Dad's land. The same land I thought had been divided fairly. The same land no one had mentioned when I came home. I sat there, watching the screen fade to black, my face reflected faintly. Older, tired, uncertain. What else had they done? What had I missed while I was gone? Or more accurately, while they pushed me out? I'd spent years serving, believing honor meant something. Now, I wasn't even trusted with the truth. And somehow, the worst part wasn't the forgery. It was that deep down, I wasn't surprised. That night, I waited until the house was quiet. Mom had gone to bed early. Luke and Carla were staying in the guest room, door shut, lights off. I sat at the kitchen table. The old laptop hummed beside me. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. I didn't want to do this. Didn't want to feel like the untrusting one. But something told me this wasn't new. I opened the browser. Typed in the credit union's web address. Mom kept everything saved, passwords, logins, even security questions written out in a notebook beside the fridge. I logged in. The balance flashed on screen. Higher than I expected, much higher. I clicked through the statements. Transfers. Out. In. Out again. to accounts I didn't recognize, some in Carla's name, one under a joint account with Luke, all dated within the last 6 months. I stared at the screen like it might change. Like if I blinked enough, it would all vanish. But it didn't. The names were there. The routing numbers. Even the notes. Farm repairs. Equipment upgrade. Insurance payout. None of it rang true. Dad used to write checks by hand. Every penny accounted for. Now, everything was digital, quiet, invisible. Unless you knew where to look. And I hadn't been looking. Not for years. Not since they told me, "Don't worry about it, we've got it handled." I sat back, heart pounding. Not just from anger. From the ache of being left out. Again, I thought about that Christmas 5 years ago. When I sent money home. Half my deployment bonus. Told them to use it for repairs. They never even said thank you. Luke texted, "Got it." Carla replied, "Well, make it stretch." But the barn roof still leaked. The tractor was still broken. Where had it gone? How long had they been carving me out piece by piece? And what else was I too late to see? The next morning, Luke was outside early. Shirtless, fixing the gate, like he used to when we were kids. Only now, he didn't wave when he saw me. Just a glance. Then back to the latch. Carla sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, scrolling her phone. She looked up briefly when I walked in. "Morning," she said, eyes already back on the screen. There was something in the air. Not tension, exactly. More like expectation. Like they were waiting for me to leave again. Like I was a guest. One who'd overstayed. I poured myself coffee. Sat across from her. No one said anything for a full minute. "You sleep okay?" Carla asked. I nodded. Didn't tell her I'd barely slept. Didn't tell her I'd found the transfers. Instead, I looked at her. Really looked. New earrings. Designer watch. Not extravagant, but not cheap. Either. The kind of things you don't buy when money's tight. Her phone buzzed. She tilted it away from me as she answered. Her voice softened, playful. A man's name I didn't recognize. She laughed, then looked up. "You heading out today?" she asked. "Not sure," I said. She smiled. That tight, polite kind of smile. The kind people use at funerals or awkward dinners. I just meant in case we need to plan meals. Luke came in, wiping his hands. "Supposed to rain later," he said, not to me. I stayed quiet, because suddenly I saw it. The little things. The way they only used their mugs now. How my coat kept getting pushed to the far end of the rack. The way Mom never left me alone in the house for long. They didn't trust me. Because they knew what they'd done. And I didn't trust them either. Not anymore. But I didn't say a word. Not yet. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be seen. It was Carla who slipped first. She thought I wasn't paying attention. Or maybe she didn't care. We were in the pantry, her grabbing canned beans, me looking for sugar. The light flickered overhead. The air smelled like dust and old onions. Mom said we should probably move the deed folder. She mumbled. My hand froze over the sugar jar. I didn't turn. She's worried Evelyn might see it. Silence. Then a sharp breath. Not mine. Luke's. He was standing just outside the door. I stepped out slowly. Looked right at both of them. Carla's face flushed. Luke's jaw tightened. I didn't say anything. Just walked past them, sugar in hand. In the kitchen, I stirred my tea with shaky fingers. Watched the leaves float, then settle. They followed behind, quiet. Too quiet. Mom was out back hanging clothes. The house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. Carla spoke first. "You know, you could have told us if you needed something." I looked up. My voice was steady. I didn't realize I had to ask permission to exist. Her mouth opened. Then closed again. Luke tried to play it off. "Come on, Evie." Nobody said that. but the way he avoided my eyes said enough. I stood, pushed the chair in slowly. "You can stop whispering," I said. "I hear just fine." I walked out before either of them could answer. Back in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, let the tea go cold in my hands. I wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something deeper, older. That bone, deep ache of realizing the people who raised you never expected you to come back whole. And maybe never wanted you to come back at all. I once forgave them. All of them. Years ago. Right after Dad died. I flew back for the funeral straight from Bahrain. Still in uniform. Still smelling like sand and jet fuel. They barely looked at me. Mom kept touching the casket like she didn't trust it was real. Luke handled the church logistics. Carla cried loud enough for both of them. And I stood there, trying to feel something other than numb. After the service, they gathered in the kitchen, eating, drinking, remembering. No one saved me a chair. I stood for most of the afternoon, refilled trays, washed plates, like a stranger in my own childhood home. That night I overheard them, Luke and Carla, in the garage, thinking I was asleep, arguing about money, who deserved what to do with the land. Luke said, "Eve doesn't care. She's not really part of this anymore." And Carla didn't correct him. She just said, "Well, we'll make sure she gets something small." I didn't confront them. I didn't even cry. I told myself, they're grieving, they don't mean it, it'll pass, so I forgave them, silently, privately, and I left again. But this time, it felt different, not just a moment of grief, not just careless words. This felt planned, measured, like I'd been written out long before I even came back. That old forgiveness. It was stitched together from obligation and hope. But now, there was no thread strong enough to patch this tear. That evening, I didn't sit with them. Dinner was chicken casserole. I heard the plates clink from the guest room. Smelled the sharp cheddar, the overcooked green beans. No one called me. I stayed seated on the edge of the bed, watching the light fade out the window. The sky turned that deep winter blue. Cold, quiet, indifferent. They laughed once. Someone said something about a neighbor. The sound was muffled through the wall, but it felt sharp somehow. Like I'd been cut out of the joke. Later, I came out to get water. The kitchen was dim, just the cabinet light humming. Mom stood at the sink. She didn't turn when I walked in. She was scrubbing a glass that looked perfectly clean. Her hands moved in tight circles, again and again. "I can't sleep with dirty dishes," she said, not looking up. I opened the fridge, poured water into a mug. Stood there, waiting. She rinsed the glass, shook it once, and placed it upside down on the drying rack. Then finally turned to me. Her face was blank. Worn, not angry. Just tired. "You're not staying long, are you?" she asked. It wasn't cruel. It was casual. Like asking if it might rain. I looked at her. Really looked. This was the woman who once cried when I left for officer training. Who mailed cookies to Kuwait, wrapped in 3 layers of foil. Who wore my navy pin to church. And now, she could barely meet my eyes. "I haven't decided," I said. She nodded once. Then walked past me, footsteps light on the tile. Didn't say goodnight. I stood there, the mug still in my hand. The silence behind her was louder than any insult. That's when I knew. They weren't going to fix this. They didn't want to. Whatever story they'd told themselves, I wasn't in it anymore. So I'd write my own. Quietly. Carefully. But not gently. The next day, my key didn't fit. I'd gone out for a walk. Just to clear my head. Just to breathe something that didn't taste like tension. I wandered past the barn, past the old fence line, where Dad used to point and say, "That's the farthest the sun hits before it rests." I'd always loved that. But when I came back, the side door was locked. My key, a copy I'd had for 20 years, wouldn't turn. I stood there, hand on the knob, like a guest waiting to be let in. The porch light was on, voices inside, Carla's laugh, the low hum of the TV. No one came to the door. I knocked once. Waited. Then again. Finally, Luke opened it. "Oh, thought you went into town," he said. No apology. No explanation. I stepped inside. The warmth hit me like a wall. It smelled like cinnamon and pork roast. They'd made dinner. For 3. Mom didn't even look up. "Hope you're not mad," Carla said. "We thought you'd taken the truck." I didn't respond. I just walked past them, down the hall. My boots sounded louder than usual. When I reached the guest room, the door was closed. I pushed it open. Something felt off. The bed had been stripped. The pillows gone, no suitcase in sight. I turned around. "Mom moved your things to the den," Carla said behind me. "The couch folds out," Luke added. Figured it made more sense. No one asked me. No one told me. I walked into the den. Everything was there, neatly folded, placed beside the pull-out. A single blanket. No pillow. I sat down slowly. Felt the old couch springs shift beneath me. I could have yelled. Demanded an explanation. Thrown every betrayal in their faces. But I didn't. Because the deeper pain wasn't the bed. It was the decision. They didn't want me here. Not really. And I remembered. Years ago. When I came home from my first deployment. There was a banner on the fence, a cake. Even Carla hugged me. Back then, I believed in things like family always forgives. Now I saw the difference between absence and exclusion. Later that night, I found her sitting at the dining table. The others had gone to bed. The house was dark except for the small lamp she kept over her crossword puzzles. She didn't look up when I walked in, just circled a word with her pen. I stood there a moment, waiting. Finally, I sat down across from her. She glanced at me, then back to her page. "I thought you'd gone to sleep." I couldn't. I paused. Hard to sleep in a room no one asked me to be in. She set the pen down, folded her hands. "I didn't mean for it to feel that way." I looked at her. "Then what way did you mean it?" She sighed. Her fingers tapped the table, slow, steady. "It's just, you come and go. Always have. You don't stay. You don't ask. So we made do." I swallowed hard. "You made do without me." She didn't deny it. "You had your own life," she said. "The Navy, the deployments. We handled things here." I wanted to tell her. About the email. The transfers. The forged signature. But I didn't, because I saw something in her face. A quiet resolve, not anger. Not regret. Just settledness. Like she'd already made peace with cutting me out. I searched her eyes. Looking for the woman who used to brush my hair when I had nightmares. The one who mailed me recipes and prayed over my letters. But that woman wasn't sitting in front of me anymore. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. But she didn't hold back either. Her hand stayed still, warm, familiar, but empty. And I realized, even if she loved me, she had still chosen them. I stood up, tucked the chair back in. "Good night, Mom." She nodded. Didn't say it back. I walked to the den, unfolded the couch. Laid down without turning on the light. And for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because something inside me had gone quiet. Done waiting, done hoping. Done begging for room in a house that no longer had my name on the door. The next morning, I woke before the sun. No alarm. No sound. Just that deep pull in the chest. When you know something's changed, and it won't be undone. The house was silent. I moved like water. Careful. Quiet. Watching every floorboard. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee. Not for the warmth. Just to hold something steady in my hands. They were all still asleep, or pretending to be. I sat at the table, opened my notebook, the same one I used in the Navy. Leather cover, pages lined and tight. And I made a list. Not of what they'd done, but what I could prove. Transfer document, email timestamp. Bank statements, routing numbers. A forged signature, visual mismatch. Ownership records, county office. Property deed, mom's cabinet. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth to stand on its own. By 9 a.m. I was dressed, coat zipped, keys in hand. Where you off to? Luke asked. Half dressed in the hallway. Library, I said, without pause. He didn't follow. I drove into town. Not to the library, but to the county courthouse. The clerk recognized my name. She smiled politely, pulled the files. Family land, she asked. Something like that, I said. I flipped through the paperwork. Everything looked normal, until it didn't. There it was, filed 6 weeks ago, an adjustment to the land title. 2 primary owners, Luke Hayes and Carla Hayes. No mention of me, no third line, no asterisk, no pending inclusion, gone, just like that. When I got back, the house was empty. Luke's truck was gone. Carla's scarf missing from the hook. Perfect. I went straight to the hall closet, where Mom kept the locked fireproof box. Same one she used to guard like treasure. Birth certificates. Bonds. The deed. She never thought to change the hiding spot. Behind the old quilts, under the shoebox of cassette tapes. I pulled it out, set it on the floor. The key was still taped to the back. Inside, it was all there. The original title. Dad's will. My name, typed clearly on line 3. I took photos, page by page, zoomed in on dates, signatures, notary stamps. Then I found something else. A letter, folded in half, yellowed at the edges. From Dad, to all 3 of us. Dated a month before his stroke. Whatever happens, keep it equal. You're all my kids. All of you. I stared at those words. My throat tightened. Not with grief. With clarity. They'd broken a promise. Not just to me, to him. I put everything back exactly how it was. No rush. No panic. Just precision. Then I went to the shed. Under a tarp, near the rusted rake, I found the old tackle box. Not for fishing anymore. Now it held my last tool, a GoPro camera. Dusty, but still working. I set it up behind the coat rack in the living room. Angled low. Wide frame. I needed their words. Not mine. Back in the den, I pulled out an old flip phone. My backup from deployment days. The number I hadn't dialed in 5 years was still saved. Murphy, J.A. I hit call. 2 rings. Hayes. His voice came through, scratchy but sure. It's time, I said. No uniforms. Just facts. A pause, then. Send everything. I'll handle the rest. That evening, I cooked dinner. Not out of kindness. Out of control. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with garlic. Everything they liked. Everything I used to make before I left for Bahrain. I set the table for 4. Laid out real plates. Real napkins. Luke looked surprised. Carla suspicious. Mom didn't say a word. We ate mostly in silence. Knives scraping, forks tapping. The clock ticking above the stove. I poured more tea into Carla's glass. Smiled gently. I stopped by the courthouse today. I said, just loud enough. Her fork froze mid-air. Luke cleared his throat. Why? Needed to update some veteran paperwork, I said. Shrugged. Then leaned in. Just slightly. Funny, though. Clerk said there was a recent title change. A pause. Just a second. But I saw it. Carla's jaw tightened. Luke reached for the salt he didn't use. Oh, Carla said, too light. Probably just the refinancing stuff Mom did. I nodded. Maybe. I let it hang. Then smiled. So glad we keep things transparent. The GoPro behind the coat rack blinked silently. Recording. I didn't need a confession. Just the cracks. After dinner, I offered to do the dishes. Another surprise. Mom lingered nearby, drying plates with slow hands. "You've changed," she said softly. "Have I?" "You're quieter now. Used to argue more." "Maybe I just started listening better." She didn't answer. I let the water run longer than needed. Listened to their footsteps creak down the hallway. Then I pulled the memory card from the camera, slipped it into my coat pocket. Proof? Not quite. But a beginning. Some truths don't come all at once. They gather, piece by piece. Like the quiet shift in a room when someone realizes, you're not the same anymore. I waited until Sunday. Church always left the house quiet by mid-morning. Carla and Luke never missed a service. Not out of faith, but out of habit. Appearances mattered here. Mom stayed behind that day. Said her knees hurt. I offered to make her tea. She nodded, settled into the recliner with a blanket and her crossword. I moved through the house slowly, methodically. No rush. The GoPro footage was already transferred to my flash drive. The title documents, the forged emails, Dad's letter, organized in folders, labeled and dated. Murphy had reviewed everything. Sent back one sentence. "You have more than enough." Still, I wasn't ready to confront. Not yet. I needed them to hear it from someone they couldn't talk over. Someone they couldn't gaslight, dismiss, or guilt. So, I made a call. Local attorney, veterans friendly, female-owned. I told her everything in 20 minutes. She listened, quiet, then said, "Well, draft the demand letter. But if you want them to feel it, do it in person." I knew exactly when. Luke's birthday was coming up. He'd planned a family lunch at the house. Neighbors invited. Old friends. People he liked to impress. He'd ordered catering. Carla was handling the decorations. The perfect audience. So I helped. Set the table. Polished silverware. Cleaned the windows till they gleamed. No one suspected a thing. They thought I was folding. Returning to the old role, the helpful sister, the quiet background. They didn't see the steel in my stillness. They never had. The day of the party came wrapped in sunshine. Late winter, but the air held a hint of spring. Neighbors arrived in their Sunday clothes, hands full of pies and potato salad. The house filled quickly. Voices echoed off the high ceilings. The smell of roast beef and barbecue mixed with perfume and lemon cleaner. I moved through it all like furniture, smiling when spoken to, refilling drinks, carrying trays. I heard my name a few times, soft, polite. "She's back for good." You think. Thought she was living in California now. Didn't she do something in the military? I didn't answer. Carla floated from room to room like a hostess from one of those small town magazines. Perfect posture. Too much lipstick. Luke shook hands, laughed a little too loud. He loved attention, always had. Mom stayed mostly quiet. Sat by the window wearing her pale blue cardigan. Every so often, her eyes would find me. Then look away. At 1:30, lunch was served. Plastic plates. Paper napkins with balloons printed on them. Carla stood to toast. "To Luke," she said, glass raised. "For always being the anchor of this family." People clapped. Luke smiled wide. Then she added, "And for handling everything Dad left behind. With integrity." The word hung there. I didn't move. Just reached into my tote bag, pulled out a single flash drive. Plain. Black. Placed it gently next to the punch bowl. A few people noticed. "Everything okay, Evelyn?" Carla asked. I looked up. Smiled. My turn. The TV was already on, muted in the background. Luke had been playing sports highlights earlier. I walked over, grabbed the remote, and switched inputs. Inserted the flash drive. The screen blinked once, then loaded a simple folder. In Dad's words. No one spoke. I opened the first file. A scanned letter, Dad's handwriting. Shaky but clear. "To my children, I built this land for all of you. No favorites. No tricks. Keep it equal, or it'll eat you alive. Someone gasped. I opened the next file. Title deed dated before his death. All 3 names. Then the revised version. 2 names. No Evelyn. I let it sit there. The room grew still. Forks paused mid-air. Carla's face drained of color. Luke stood up slowly. What is this? I turned to the crowd. Neighbors, friends, faces I'd known since I was 10. This is what was taken, I said, silently, carefully, while I was gone. Then I clicked play on the final video. The footage was grainy but clear. Me at the dinner table. Carla flinching. Luke shifting. The words. Clerk said there was a recent title change. I paused the video just as Carla replied. Probably just the refinancing stuff Mom did. I didn't need to explain further. The silence did it for me. People started murmuring. One woman turned toward Luke. Another whispered something to Mom, who didn't meet her eyes. I stood there, steady. Not shaking. Not breaking. For once, I wasn't the one explaining myself. Carla opened her mouth, then closed it. Luke's jaw clenched. But he sat down. I picked up the flash drive. Held it in my palm. Justice doesn't always look like a courtroom, I said. Sometimes it just needs a room full of truth. And I walked out. No shouting. No slamming doors. Just a quiet trail of eyes following me all the way to the porch. Pause. Would you have stayed and fought, or walked out like I did? I didn't look back when I stepped off the porch. Didn't need to. The silence behind me said enough. Not one voice called my name. Not even Mom's. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. Sunlight hit the side of my face, but I didn't feel warm. Just clear. I got in the truck and sat for a moment. Hands on the steering wheel. Breathing steady. I could still hear the faint hum of the party. Music playing, a door creaking open, murmurs rising like wind through dry grass. Then the front door slammed. Once. I pulled away. Drove slow, windows cracked just enough to let in the cold. Downtown was empty. Sunday quiet. I parked by the diner. Walked to the corner bench across from the hardware store. Same one Dad and I used to sit on after errands. He'd sip coffee from a thermos. Let me eat half a brownie from his coat pocket. We never talked much. Didn't need to. I sat there now, coat zipped, hands folded. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed them anything. Not an explanation. Not my presence. Not even my silence. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. Instead, I felt something quieter. A kind of stillness. Like my bones had stopped bracing. Back at the house, I imagined Carla scrambling. Luke pacing. Mom staring out the same window she always did. Let them explain this to themselves. Let them sit with it. Let the truth echo in their own voices. I wasn't their problem anymore. The first message came that evening. From Carla. Can we talk? I stared at the screen. 3 words. No punctuation. No apology. I didn't reply. The second came the next morning. This time from Luke. Did you have to do it like that? I set the phone down. No, sorry. No, we were wrong. Just discomfort with being seen. That afternoon, they showed up at the diner. I was sitting at the counter, halfway through a slice of pecan pie. Same booth Dad used to sit in when he didn't want to talk to anyone. They slid into the booth across from me. Carla spoke first. Her voice was soft, her hands fidgeting with the napkin. Evelyn, we didn't mean to cut you out. I sipped my coffee, said nothing. Luke leaned forward. It was complicated. We thought you wouldn't care. You decided that for me, I said. Carla blinked. Luke exhaled. We thought. Carla started. I know what you thought. I cut in. You thought I'd stay quiet. Again. They looked down. Like kids caught lying, not adults making things right. I didn't want to embarrass you, I added. But you left me no room to protect you quietly. They didn't argue. They couldn't. Luke finally said. What now? I looked at both of them, not angry. Just finished. I'm done fighting to belong in a family that made peace with losing me. I stood, dropped cash on the table, nodded once. You can deal with the lawyer. I've said what I needed to. And I walked out. Not with triumph, not with rage, just with something I hadn't felt in a long, long time, peace. 2 days later, I came back to the house. Not to stay. Just to say goodbye. I knocked, even though I still had a key. Mom answered the door slowly. She looked smaller, or maybe I had just grown too far from who I used to be in her eyes. She stepped aside without a word. The house smelled the same. Lemon cleaner. A faint hint of meatloaf. Old wood and silence. I walked into the kitchen. Paused by the table. The same one we'd sat at 1,000 times. Over tea, over silence, over everything unsaid. She poured me a cup without asking. Sat down across from me. For a while, we just sat. No words. Then, finally, "You didn't have to do it like that." I looked up. I did. Because saying it quietly didn't work. She stared at her cup. "I just didn't want things to fall apart," she said. "They already had," I replied. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the mug. She didn't meet my eyes. "I loved you," she whispered. I nodded. "I know. But you didn't protect me." She flinched. "And I hated that I still cared." "I wanted to believe you'd come back and be the same," she added. "I did come back," I said, "but I wasn't the one who changed." Silence again. Then I stood. "I'm leaving. For real this time. Not running. Not banished. Just done." She didn't argue. I reached into my coat pocket. Left the house key on the table. And as I turned to go, I said, without bitterness, "I forgive you. But I'm not coming back." Outside, the wind felt sharper. Cleaner. And for the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from something broken. I was walking towards something I could finally build. I moved into a small rental by the river. 1 bedroom. Big window. Quiet neighbors. The kind of place where nothing needed to be explained. I bought mismatched dishes from the thrift store. Hung up my old Navy photo in the hallway. The one they'd taken down back home. Every morning, I walked to the bakery on 3rd. Joan, the owner, always handed me my coffee before I even asked. I liked that. I volunteered twice a week at the Veterans Center. Nothing dramatic. Helped organize paperwork. Sat with women who reminded me of, well, me. We shared silence. Sometimes stories. Some were younger, still in uniform. Some older, with eyes that had seen too much and still wanted to see more. One afternoon, a girl named Lee sat across from me. Barely 22, sharp-tongued, angry. "They told me I was too loud," she muttered. "Too much trouble. Too everything." I looked at her. Said, "They probably meant you scared them." She blinked. Then smiled, just barely. We talked for 2 hours. The next week, she came back, brought 2 more girls. I didn't call it anything. Not a group, not a program. But they kept showing up. So I kept showing up too. I took the small inheritance that was finally released. After the attorney finished his work and put it into something solid, I rented a space on Main. Painted the walls warm gray. Bought secondhand chairs and a coffee pot that hissed like an old friend. Hung a sign on the door. The 3rd room. No explanation. Just a place to sit. To breathe. To speak when you were ready. People came. Women mostly. Some men too. No one had to tell their story if they didn't want to. But most did, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was building. Not a legacy of land. Not family pride or names etched on brass. But something quieter. A place no one could be erased from. Sometimes I still thought about the farm, not with longing. Not with bitterness. Just as something that happened. Like a place I passed through. like a version of me that no longer fit. Mom sent a card last spring. Said the lilacs had bloomed early. She didn't mention Luke. Or Carla. Didn't ask me to visit. I didn't send one back, not because I was angry, but because I had nothing else to say. The truth had already been said. And it had stood. That was enough. One evening, I stayed late at the third room. Lee had just finished telling a story I'd never heard, about being told she was too much, for the third time in her life. She laughed after. Said, "Wes, I just have a third gear people don't like." I smiled. There's nothing wrong with a woman who won't idle. She grinned. And something in me settled deeper. Later, alone, I turned off the lights, sat by the window. Watched the last bus pull away from the corner. Outside, the air smelled like rain on warm pavement. Familiar. Forgiving. I thought about Dad. How he used to say, "Fix what's broken. But don't break yourself doing it." I hadn't fixed the family. Hadn't made them see what they didn't want to see. But I hadn't broken either. I had built something instead. Something that didn't need permission. Didn't require anyone to clap. Didn't come with inheritance or a handshake. Just a door. And a welcome that meant what it said. Sometimes legacy isn't what they leave you. It's what you leave behind when no one expected you to leave anything at all. So I left peace. Left space. And I left a light on, for the next woman who walked in tired. Holding stories no one had time to hear. She'd sit down. And when she was ready, she'd begin, knowing she wasn't too much, she was just enough. Pause. Some mornings I still wake before the sun. Old habit, years of duty, years of discipline that never really left my bones. But now, there's no alarm. No orders. Just the soft sound of the river outside my window, and the slow bloom of light on the wall across from my bed. I get up. I stretch. I make coffee the long way, the way my dad used to. Slow drip, one scoop too strong. And then I sit. Not because I'm waiting for anything. But because, for the first time in a long time, I don't owe my time to anyone else. The shop opens at 9. But even before the door is unlocked, someone is usually waiting. A woman in her 50s. A teenage girl with her hoodie pulled tight. A veteran with a notebook and nowhere else to go. I never ask why they come. They'll tell me if they're ready. Sometimes they just sit, hands wrapped around warm mugs, eyes fixed on the window. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they laugh. And sometimes, they look at me like they don't know what to call what they're feeling. But they know I've felt it tilling. That's the only credential I need now. Not the rank, not the medals, not the titles. Just this, that I survived, that I rebuilt, that I stopped asking people to make room for me and learned to build the room myself. They used to say I was too sharp, too independent, too much, and for a while I believed them. But now I see what I was: just enough. Enough to carry my own story. Enough to forgive without forgetting. Enough to walk away without slamming a door. Because I'd already made peace with never needing to walk back in. Mom still sends cards. They're shorter now. Simpler. She asks how I'm doing. She tells me about the garden. She doesn't ask me to visit. And I don't offer. But when I read her words, I don't feel hate. I feel distance. Like a horizon I've finally reached. And now know better than to cross again. Sometimes, Leah and the other girls ask if I ever miss home. I tell them home is wherever you stop apologizing for taking up space. They nod. Some tear up. Some look away. But they understand. Because most of us, at some point, were taught to shrink. Taught to stay quiet. Taught to accept less so others could have more. But not anymore. Now we teach each other how to stand again. How to hold a line. How to speak without flinching. How to walk out without turning bitter. That's the legacy I care about. Not property. Not approval. Not the version of me they wanted to remember. But the woman I became when no one was watching. The woman who rose anyway. I used to think justice had to be loud, had to be public, had to humiliate the ones who hurt you. But I've learned something quieter, more lasting. Justice is knowing who you are, even when they try to erase you. Closure isn't about winning. It's about not needing their permission to live freely. And legacy. Legacy is this: that someone walks into a room you built and feels seen for the first time in years. That's enough for me. So if you're reading this, if you've ever been told you were too much, if you've ever been erased from a photo, a family, or a future, I hope you remember this: you are not too much. You are not invisible. You do not need to shrink to be loved. You only need to choose yourself, again and again, until the choosing no longer hurts, until it becomes freedom. I found mine. Not all at once, not easily, but fully. And now I leave the porch light on. For the next woman who needs to find her way. For the next story that begins where someone thought it ended. So tell me, where are you listening from? And what part of yourself did you have to rebuild when no one else thought you could? You're not alone. You never were.